Hi everyone, how are you doing today? My name is Alex Lopez, I'm a product specialist at Capture One and I will be hosting today's session. So first of all, don't panic, David's still around. Actually, he's in the backstage today, he's in the chat, he will be helping moderate and he will also be taking some questions and answers. So I can see that we have a super international crew today. Again, thank you all so much for joining this session about levels and curves. So I just wanted to welcome you here. I wanted also to let you know that you will probably start seeing more of me from now on, so I hope that you will enjoy today's class. So, curves and levels, there's a lot to it. It's a very kind of geeky thing, but I always thought it was worth showing these tools because they are super useful. They can be very intuitive once you understand some basic logic on how they operate, and because they are super powerful for photo editing in general. So behind that, I will be running today's session a little bit differently to how you're used to. So I prepared some slides because I thought that something very useful to understand how levels and curves actually operate is to understand some basic concepts behind digital photography, like actually how digital photography works and what is under the hood when you see a preview on your Capture One software. So I think that's about an intro. Let's go and let's jump right onto it. So these are the slides I prepared. Don't worry, it will not all be slides. I will be using these as support material to the examples I will be showing you in Capture One. So let's go. So the first thing that I wanted to cover today was, you're probably already familiar with this if you have been doing digital photography for a while, but this is like the basis of everything we're going to be talking about today, so I thought a reminder was worth it. So this is the two different color models that exist. So we have the additive model, the RGB model that we are used to when we talk about monitors on any kind of screen devices, and there is also the subtractive model, which is a CMYK, that is the one that we use for printing, any sort of ink, paint, and basically the objects that you touch around in your daily life. So we will not be talking about this CMYK model today. This we will leave for another session, maybe in the future. But just so you have a little reminder in mind, so CMYK, this model, this is not what we will be using today, where the primary colors are yellow, magenta, and cyan. And the mix of them three results in black. That's what is happening in the real world that we see and we touch with paint and things like that. But today we will be focusing on the additive model, the RGB model, that is what actually Capture One operates with. In this model, this is a light model where the main primary colors are red, green, and blue, and the combination of them three would result in white. So this is what interests us today. So having covered that, let's move on. And let's see why this is important when we talk about digital photography. So the reason this is important, it's because we need to think of an image that we see on a screen as a combination of these three channels. So there is actually one image that is formed by these three different parts: the red channel, the green channel, and the blue channel. And the overlap of these three things is what makes any image that you are seeing right now on your screens. And this is important to understand because when we talk about levels and curves, there may be levels and curves where we are adjusting these three channels simultaneously, but then there is also the possibility to adjust these three channels independently, and that can be extremely useful, and during this session you will get to understand why. So let's move on. So how is this even present in Capture One? The reason why I put in this image here is just a screenshot from the Capture One interface, where you can see on the top these are the RGB and actually Luma levels that you can see in any image. So when you hover over a preview in Capture One, you will see always all of these values corresponding to the pixel that you're hovering over with your mouse. So for example, if we pick the one that is showing on the interface, the one on the top, this corresponds to the yellow petal. And there we can see some values. We can see, for example, the red value of the value corresponding to the red channel is 226. Then we have a value for the green channel of 218, a value of blue channel for 0, and then a Luma value for 195. So the Luma channel doesn't contain any color information, it just contains luminosity information, but it's showing up anyways and it can be useful to have it there. So why it is important to understand that? Because when we understand the logic behind this RGB magic, when we look at these values, we can kind of guess what color it is, even if we're not seeing the preview. So that is useful, for example, when you cannot really trust your monitor. It may be worth using this indicator to see if we are doing things right. So for example, what I would understand if I didn't see the yellow petal on the flower, if I see that we have a component of red and a component of green but no blue, then that indicates me that the color that we are selecting is a mix of red and green, which would be yellow, which is what we see on the image. In the same way, I pointed out other examples. So for example, these red petals in the background, they have a predominant red value of 216 and then significantly lower on the other green and blue values. This indicates that this color that we are selecting is primary red with a tad of blue. That would be kind of towards, leading it a little bit towards magenta, but still predominantly red. Then we have like this purple that is again a mix of red and blue. And we have also on the right side, I also marked the white because I thought it's important for you to understand what happens when you select white. So of course, all of these 4 levels, they are in a range between 1 and 255. So when we have any of the channels showing 255, it means that this channel is clipping. So in here, for example, we have this white color in the petal on the right, and we have very similar values across the 4 different channels. So we have 231, 232. So when we have such value, when all the channels are in balance, that means that what we are getting is white or gray or something close to white. So the higher the value, the closer it is to white. This is not pure white because then that should be 245, but for now it is something pretty close to white, which is how we wanted to keep it. So this was just a little introduction. So you have an example of how these things operate in Capture One and where you can see this information going on. So let's move on actually to talk a little bit more about the levels, and we will be jumping to Capture One in just a second. So what is going on with the levels? What is the structure of this tool? So we have these 4 different tabs. We have the RGB that would adjust all the channels in the same time, and that is very useful for adjusting contrast, brightness, and all of that. And then we have separate channels for the red, the green, and the blue. So how does this tool actually work? We also see on the histogram these channels represented actually, and we have a 4th indicator for the Luma channel, even though we cannot change this channel around in the levels, but we can in the curves. We'll see that later on in the session. So how does this operate? I like to start today with the levels tool actually because it's a little bit more simple than the curves. The curves are a little bit more complex, but the reason why the levels are more simple and easy to play around with, even if you're not very experienced with this tool, is that we only have so many points that we can work around. So we have the input levels on the bottom of the tool. So one on the left for the black corresponding with the position on the histogram. Then we have another input level for white on the right. And in the middle, we have an input level for the midtones. And this is the points that we can play around with. There's not much more we can do. There is, on the top, there is the output levels for black and white. There is none for the midtones, but just so you know that those are there, and those can come in handy at times as well. Okay, so let's go into the Capture One interface and let's see what happens. Oh, also a little detail that I thought it's worth mentioning is that when we adjust contrast and exposure and brightness from the RGB channels, as opposed to doing it from the contrast slider, we will see some things changing around as well in the saturation of the colors. So there is this link between the contrast and the saturation. So we will see a little bit of a different result when we do that from the contrast or we do that from the levels. I'll show you an example. Let's go right into the Capture One interface now. Okay, so this is the first example of today. I know that this picture looks a little bit dull, but it's going to end up completely different by the end of this session. So the first thing we want to do, even before we jump on to the levels and whatnot, we want to adjust exposure a little bit so that we can see what's what. So let's increase the exposure about 1.5, and then let's move on to levels. So here we have the levels. A really good way to start by playing around with these, if you are not familiar with them, is just to use the auto levels, and that typically works pretty well actually. So here next to the name of the tool we have this little magic wand. So if we click on that, that's going to adjust only the input levels. And did you see what happened? So when we did that, it's like Capture One drags this point that represents black. It used to be here, so what it does, it's like it pushes it towards the beginning of this histogram that is starting to be there. And this is kind of telling Capture One, okay, so this should be the black. This is where the darkest part of the image is this, so this should be black, and that's what it's doing. Same thing with the white. So this is just moving this input white level around, is basically telling Capture One what should look white on the image. So this is what the auto levels did, and I think that did a fine job. Of course, we need to compensate with some other tools now to make sure that we maintain detail across the image. But before we do that, I wanted to show you actually the difference between these and the contrast slider. So I'm just going to overdo it just a little bit. Maybe not that much, otherwise we'll lose too much info. Maybe let's just adjust this a little bit so that we can see brighter colors. All right, so that gives us a hint. So this is how it looks like when we adjust from the levels. And you can see that it also pumped up the saturation just a little bit. It's definitely visible on the greens, especially on the ones here on the grass, which are a little bit more vibrant. So let's reset that now, and let's try to apply the same adjustment from the contrast slider. So when we apply this adjustment from the contrast slider, we also see a nice balance between contrast and saturation. Just keep that in mind that it will behave a little bit differently. So let's restart the contrast. Let's restart this. And we're just gonna start editing this photo, and I'm just going to do it as I would normally would. I'm gonna put this back to around 1.3. I think that will work good. So we are fine about saturation, and the shadows and the highlights we will control from a combination of levels and high dynamic range. Okay, so let's just start again from the auto adjustments, and then let's see what's what. Something that I really like to do when I work with levels and curves both is to start playing around with a mix of these tools and the high dynamic range, because now it looks really dark here, but when we open up the shadows a little bit from this slider, you can see how the detail is definitely coming back, and it's coming back in a really nice way, because it allows us to have a lot of detail in the shadows while maintaining contrast and, you know, something a little bit more punchy. In the same way, we're going to do that with highlights, so we're going to recover a little bit of the highlights, and it may be a good idea to start playing around with these tools and readjusting again the input levels for white and black, so that we can have an image with nice contrast, but still maintaining a lot of detail. So I think that wouldn't be a bad starting point. Okay, so we have been playing around with the blacks and the whites, and then what happens with the handle in the middle? So as I said before, that represents the midtones. So just before jumping onto that, I'm just going to show you how that relates to the brightness slider. So the brightness slider and this midtones handle, it's kind of doing the same thing. Of course, there is many ways to apply adjustments in Capture One, and you just need to find one that works better for you or for the image you're working with. So for example, let's bring up some brightness. So okay, that's how it would look like. I'm overdoing it again just a little bit. Let's reset that, and now let's go to the midtones. So just keep in mind, it may be a little bit counterintuitive until you get used to it, because if you move this point towards the right where the whites should be, it's actually not going to lighten it, it's going to darken it. So it works the other way around, keep that in mind. Then if we open up like that, we can see that the effect is quite similar to what happened when I did that from the brightness slider. Personally, I prefer using, well, I use the brightness slider too, but personally I prefer using the levels if I'm working here with the shadows and the highlights too, because that would allow me to keep things together in the same tool. And then it's kind of also easier to realize where things are coming from when we apply a certain effect on our photos. All right, so let's readjust a little bit. Let's keep it somewhere around there. It may be that we need to play around again with the blacks and the whites. That's totally fine. Just do that until you find a result you're comfortable with. Okay, so this is how it would be just for a basic contrast and brightness adjustment here. So something that you might be wondering right now, it's like, so okay, if this works kind of the same as the contrast slider, and if it works kind of the same as the brightness slider, why not do it from these tools, and why bother even working with the levels? So in order to show you how different it looks like, actually, like, it's the small things that add up to different results. So in order to show you how that's different, I'm going to clone this variant. So right click on the thumbnail, clone variant. I'm going to get rid of the levels adjustment, and I'm going to try to get a close result by using the contrast and the brightness. So applying some more contrast here and a little bit more brightness. It may be that we need to bring down the blacks just a little bit with the shadow slider. Okay, great. So just a little bit more. Okay, I think that that's fairly similar right now. So let's just go full screen and let's see the difference between these two things. So there is some things that are actually different. So for example, we can see that we are kind of starting to lose detail here on the highlights. And it may be nice maintaining this super nice yellow warm reflections from the sunrise. So in this case, I prefer so much more the effect that we can get by working with the levels. The reason behind that is that when you work with levels, you can adjust the contrast of the blacks and the whites separately, whereas you work with the contrast slider, you don't have those controls independently. So if you increase contrast, you're going to darken the shadows and brighten up the highlights simultaneously, and there's nothing you can do about that. So maybe I'm kind of happy with how the shadows and the trees look like, but I'm not particularly happy with how the contrast slider is working here, because we don't have that sort of control. Also, in the same way, the contrast slider applies a little bit more dramatic adjustments, and they can be a little bit more aggressive. So for example, here you can see that we don't see as much haze anymore around here. It may be there may be photos where you want to remove the haze, and there may be some other photos when it's actually nice to keep the haze. And I think this photo is the second case, when I actually like the haze, and I also like how it looks in the background in front of this forest. And also, while it's trying to get rid of that, it's also starting to show some sort of noise here. So that's not ideal. And also, even if we take a closer look here at the tree, you can see that the details on the left are much better, and the colors are more vibrant, just because, as I was explaining before, this link between contrast and saturation that is happening very purely when we work with levels and curves. The contrast slider tries to maintain a balance between these two things, so colors will not get too out of hand, and that's something very interesting when we work with subjects like portraits or any sort of photo with a skin tone or with very problematic colors. But in general, I really like how saturation and contrast is linked from the levels and the curves tool. So for me personally, this is also obviously subject to debate, but for me the winner would be this version that I did with the levels, this combination between the levels and the high dynamic range tool. Alright, so before we move on to taking some of the questions that I can see already coming up, I can see questions coming up, right? Yeah, some of them. Oh, so David answered some of them. Okay, so we'll see about that. But if you have any questions, it's a good moment possibly to put them on now, because I'll be doing a little break before moving on to the next subject. So before we do that, this is a basic way to adjust the contrast with the levels, but there's so much more to it rather than just adjusting the contrast. And something that I wanted to show you is how levels can be incredibly useful to get rid of color casts. So also, a little tip I wanted to give you is, for me, it was very important in my learning process to start paying attention to the world around me, to how light works, to how light bounces off and reflects from the different objects around us, because that helped me understand how light works, and it helped me detect and better correct color casts. So for example, in this image now, I can see that we have a strong green color cast. So where is that coming from actually? So, well, this is coming from the environment. We are in front of this forest. There is a lot of these grass. There was also more grass behind and around the camera. It's a beautiful place in Poland, so many years ago. But this is how we have this green cast, and when we start realizing how these casts work, we can also locate that the cast is affecting more the shadows than anything else. So it is not affecting the sky because this is where the main source of light is coming from, but is affecting the shadows quite dramatically, and I would like to get rid of this cast. So we can do that from different tools in Capture One, but the reason why I always like to do this from either the levels or the curves, it's because it's like a really fine, pure way of getting rid of this cast, because you're not throwing like a filter on top of the photo to get rid of the cast, because then it's like things start mixing up, it starts mixing up with other adjustments. If you do that from the levels or the curves, you're actually adjusting the actual channels that compose the picture that you're seeing. So this is why you can get a much more precise and kind of pure looking result. Let's see what I'm talking about. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my slides for a second, just because it's important to keep in mind the color wheel and how it looks like and how it works like, in order to understand what I'm about to talk. Okay, yeah, so this is a basic color wheel. I also recommend that you keep it around at all times while you get familiar with the curves and the levels, because it can be really useful to have it as a consulting material. If you don't want to have a different slide, a little trick is just to use the color balance tool in Capture One, because that would also give you a color wheel that you can have permanently there in your interface. Alright, so let's say I have this green cast, we talked about it, so how could we get rid of it? So one possible way to get rid of it would be to add a cast of the complementary colors. So in this case it would be red or magenta actually. So we could look at adding another tint from the levels tool. So let's try that assumption and see how that works. Going back to my picture here, let's go on to the red levels, and maybe let's just play around with the midtones. So let's try that assumption. If we take the levels over to the right, that is decreasing the quantity of red channel that is showing up in this picture. So that's actually making it greener. So we want to go over to the other side. I'm just overdoing it right now. So when I move that, you can actually see that this is starting to get a really strong red cast. We don't want that, but it would be enough to just do a little bit of that, just to get rid of the green cast. So that is looking better, but it's also tinting the rest of the photo, because we're working from the midtones here. So possibly better than that would be working with the output levels for red. So if we increase the output levels for red in the shadows, that is, remember where our color cast was there, this would be a way to getting rid of these cast. So for example, somewhere around there, that would start looking better. And also think about when you are working with the output levels, it also may affect contrast, so it is possible that you need to readjust the RGB levels again. Okay, cool, this is one way to do it. It's not my favorite way to do it. I have an even better favorite way of doing this. So let's go back to the wheel just for a second. So when you start understanding this image as a combination of these three channels, the red, green, and blue that we saw with the example before, then you understand that you can get the same result by reducing the channel where the cast is. So if we want to get rid of a green cast in the shadows, it may just be enough to work with the input green level in the channels. So let's go back to the image, and again, let's try that assumption. Alright, so let's go to the green channel, and in this case we're going to reduce the green input, like so. So when I do that dramatically, you can see that this image is starting to get not a red cast, but a magenta cast. This is a complementary color. The complementary color, just as a tip, is the one that sits right across the wheel. So when we talk about the complementary color of green, that will be magenta. Okay, so when we do that dramatically, it's going to be tinted in a very weird way, but if we do that ever so slightly, we can see that we can get rid of this cast actually in a very nice way. So what's happening now is that the image is acquiring a certain magenta tint in the shadows. So how do we fix that again? So the next step would be then dropping the blue, because if we think what magenta is built from, it's built from a mix of red and blue. So if we want the shadows to look a little bit closer to the warmer side of things, then we also need to get rid of a little bit of the blue that is sitting on that slider in the shadows. Let's go back and let's do it. So moving on to my blue channel now, I'm going to also reduce the input of blue. And we can see how that's starting to look now so much better. So that's another thing, right? So if we see before and after, well, that's come a long way, right? Just with these levels and the highlights and the shadows and the exposure. So very basic tools allow us to do very interesting things. I think now it's still looking a little bit too blue, so it may be that I need to do this a little bit more subtly. I just wanted to make it very visible, but let's readjust a bit. I think that's looking nice. So let's see before and after of just the levels tool. So before and after, and you can see how that green cast is gone in a really nice, in a really natural way. So this is why I like to correct cast with the levels, again, because it looks very pure and it allows us to maintain nice detail without kind of mixing a lot of adjustments together. Again, just levels, high dynamic range, and exposure slider. I don't think that's too bad. And again, the photos come a long way. So if we would try to get rid of the cast with a different tool like the color balance or the white balance, let's try to get somewhere similar with this other one that we just did with the contrast slider, if you remember that in the beginning. So let's try to get rid of that just using the white balance. That's already looking kind of weird. So let's compare these two again and let's see why it's interesting to have something was going on here. All right, that went crazy for a second, but we are back on track. Whoopsie. I think things are starting to heat up a little bit, maybe. I'm not sure why this is not going full screen. Anyways, let's just maybe make this a little bit bigger like so. So you can see the difference between these two things. So on the right, we have the one that we did with the contrast slider and the white balance, and you can see that the results are not quite the same. This one, in my opinion, looks so much better. All right, I think we're ready now to take some questions. Let's see what we can find around here. I think that David already took some of those, but I will be looking at both Big Mark and on the YouTube chat. So Masoud asked, what is the difference between contrast and dehaze working? So dehaze is similar to contrast in a way, but it also does more things. So what contrast does is like it kind of stretches the histogram, so it pulls the blacks closer to the end of the histogram and the whites closer to the end of the histogram, and it would like open up the whole histogram like so. And again, it would keep a nice balance between contrast and saturation. While the dehaze, it also does more things. It also affects contrast, but it does add some saturation, and it's like a mix of contrast, saturation, and clarity. Normally, when we use the dehaze tool, we are assuming it's mostly used for landscape photos, where we can benefit from a little bit more clarity and a little bit more saturation when we are working with these things. Okay, let's go on to the YouTube chat and let's see. I think David's doing a great job, so I'm just gonna move on with the session if you like. And let's go ahead and talk a little bit now about the curves. So for that, I'm just going to go to my PDF just for a second, and let's see the difference between the levels and the curves tool. So first thing about the curves, they work in a very similar logic as the levels do, but they are a little bit different in how they operate. So we also, you can see we have the same kind of histogram where we have the representation of red, green, and blue and the Luma channels. But the difference here, well, there is some differences. So the first difference is that from the curves, the Luma channel can actually be adjusted, and that can be extremely useful at times. And I'm going to show you an example in a second. The other difference that makes curve a little bit more complex is that there is no limit as to the turning points you can make. So you can tamper with the signals quite a bit it's not only that you have one input and one output level, it's like you can create as many points as you want. So that gives you more control, but in the same time, it adds a layer of complexity. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. Also, when adjustments in the curves, like just adjusting the curves tool, it can implicate a massive change in the image, which can be good or bad depending on how familiar you are with those. I know that the curves can be a little bit intimidating at first, so I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible when we work with those. Okay, so let's just go ahead back to Capture One and let's see another example of that. So this is an example I'm going to be using today. Before jumping onto that, I wanted to thank David, who is also doing a great job on the chat, by the way, because this image and the next images I will be using, they are all his. They are from his trip to the US. He just came back recently and he did some fantastic sessions with our ambassador, Paul Reefer. Those are all found on our YouTube channel and those are great. So I do recommend you take a look if you like this kind of editing and this kind of workflow stuff for landscapes, because it really is superb. So this is the one that we will be using today. And I thought this was a great example to work with curves because we have all of these haze. This was shot from a helicopter. There was a lot of haze that day. There was probably a lot of dust in the air too. So this gives it this kind of washed out look. And we're going to try to correct that. And we're going to do that exclusively from the curves. So this is why the curves are so powerful. The thing is that you can do so much with them. So just to start easily, let's just think of it as if they were the levels, and let's try to just adjust the input of the black and the input of the white, that would be the one here, just as if we were working with the levels now. So we see the histogram. Let's start with the blacks, and let's just bring this point closer to where the histogram starts, just moving it horizontally, not vertically for now. And then on the other part, let's just take the white point and let's again bring it closer. You can see that when you click on the dot and you press and hold, there is these handles showing up, and those are super handy to indicate where in the histogram you are about. Okay, so that's just how you would adjust the input and the output levels. But then let's move on to creating some more shapes in these curves. So to start simply, I'd like to highlight this little kind of map of intersections we have here. I noticed this fairly recently, more recently than I'd like to admit, actually. But when I found out, like, they were always there, right? I just never looked at them. But when I started paying attention to these little lines that intersect, I thought it was incredibly helpful as a simple way to work with curves. So, for example, the point in the middle here, right in the middle of the tool, that would represent the midtones. So if we just draw a point there, and we just put it down horizontally, let's see what happens. So that's actually just working with the whole of the RGB channels, and we are dropping those from the midtones, and if we drop them down, we can see that we are darkening all of the midtones in the photo. And also, because this is a curve, everything else will be affected along the way in a gradual way. So what happens if we go up, as you're probably guessing by now, this would add a lot of brightness to the picture, and also kind of doing it in a linear way with the rest of the photo. Okay, so it can be actually nice to just play around with the midtones, but this is not what we're gonna be doing today. So my favorite way to work with curves is actually create only 2 points. So the thing with curves, if we don't really understand the logic of how they work, and I think also one of the reasons why many people don't use them, it's because it's kind of easy to mess around and to clip some channels and to destroy the image completely. So for example, if we wanted to do something like super weird like that, it would be super easy to break the photo. Of course, it's not completely broken, we can always go back, but that doesn't look really pleasant or motivating. So in order to avoid these things from happening, I'm going to show you how to do a super simple S-shaped curve that would work for most of your photos. Also keep in mind, the more abrupt the curve looks like, the more likely it is that you are messing something around. So let's get rid of these points. If you want to get rid of these, let's just grab them and drag them out of the curve's interface. And that would be how we go back to our previous curve. All right, so the first point I'm going to be drawing, actually, it's the one that represents the shadows. So this is why I find this line super handy. Just dropping a point here, and the intersection on the bottom left corner. And if I just take this point and I drop it vertically, that's already darkening our shadows and giving them some rich texture. So this is like the first part of it that is also going to help us getting rid of this haze that we talked about. But this is incomplete, so the next thing we need to do is just to go all the way across the tool to the top right corner, and again in the intersection, let's draw a point and let's pull this up a little bit. So you can see while I do that the highlights are being brightened up. And when we see some sort of balance like that, if we take a look at the curve that we are drawing here, this is what we call an S-shaped curve. And this curve works really well because it helps us to retain a lot of contrast and a lot of detail and texture in both the shadows and the highlights. Again, I'm going to compensate a little bit and open up the shadows with the high dynamic range tool. But I think it's really worth noting the huge change that this image underwent just with this tool. So let's just briefly see before and after. So before and after, and you can actually see that we got rid of the haze and all of this weird atmosphere just by using this one tool. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. And once you get familiar with this tool, it can actually save you lots of time from going back and forth from different sliders. All right, so also another of, like as a curiosity, one of the reasons that this curve actually works for most of the photos is because this kind of simulates how actual film operates. So when you develop actual film photography, it is never a linear curve when something is analog. So it's going to have like this S-shape. If we try to represent it digitally, it would have this sort of S-shaped curve actually when the shadows and the highlights are a little bit richer than in digital photography. Okay, so we have the S-shaped curve now, and we just did that in a very simple way when we adjusted this point and this point vertically. But what happens if we adjust them horizontally? So let's try this out and let's bring these 2 points closer together. Just, if you want to keep things simple, just try to move like on a grid, like horizontally, vertically, try not to go too crazy. So when we bring these dots closer together, we can see that what we are doing is that we are applying more contrast on the midtones area. If we separate them a little bit, then we would just purely be affecting the highlights and the shadows. So we want to maintain some balance between what we are doing here. And it may be that we want to bring them a little bit closer together, also because this picture was really flat and really hazy. So by joining these 2 dots closing together, this is kind of like applying clarity. So this is kind of what the clarity slider does, but we can do that in a much more controlled way. So you can see what I mean here. This tool is incredibly powerful. It's super flexible. There's a lot you can do with it. So this is why it's a little bit complex. So it's like this kind of thing, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. So this is the kind of thing. So when you have this understanding of curves, you can actually do pretty amazing stuff just from this one tool. Okay, so we have now nice contrast, and the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the shadows just a little bit and bring down the highlights just a tad. So somewhere around there we have great contrast, we have great detail, and I think the colors are looking great. Okay, so this, we did it all, as you can see, from the RGB curve. So some of the things you will be wondering is, where does the Luma curve come in here? Like, why do we have these 2 different curves? So going back to this link that I explained before about this link between contrast and saturation, if we take now a look again at before and after here, you can see that these colors are way more saturated than they used to be. And that came from the RGB curves adjustment. So when we adjust contrast with the RGB channels, we're going to increase saturation quite drastically. And it may be handy, like in this photo, but it may not be handy at times. So let's just see how the Luma curve operates. So to do that, I'm just going to right-click, clone variant, and I'm going to get rid of this adjustment with the curves, and I'm going to try to replicate the same adjustment from the Luma curve. So again, bringing it closer together. the output and the input levels. And let's try to simulate the same sort of S shape that I did there. So we are doing the same curve, but if we again compare the two photos side by side, we can actually see that the result is quite different. So you can see that the picture on the left, as we covered before, it was actually pretty much saturated by the RGB adjustments, while the picture on the right, the one that we did through the Luma curve, it only affected contrast, and that can give us some weird looking things when we apply it to landscapes, for example, but that can be extremely helpful when we work with other subjects, particularly portraits. So you can see that this image benefits from the extra saturation and this one clearly doesn't. But what happens when we move on to a portrait like this one? Let's try to do the same logic. Let's apply an RGB curve on the first variant and a Luma curve on the second variant. So here on the first one, we're going again to the RGB and we're just drawing this S shape as we did before. And then back to the thumbnail, right click, clone variant. Let's get rid of this RGB one and let's do a similar thing, just working from the Luma channel. So again, let's compare side by side. Let's go full screen. So what is actually happening here? When we work with the RGB channels as before, we can see that the colors are being saturated, but this is not particularly convenient here. Also because when we operate from the RGB channels, the channels that are going to mostly be affected, it's not so much the blue channel, but it's mostly the red and the yellow channels. Sorry, the red and the green channels. And this happens to be where all the skin tones are lying within. So there is not too much blue on the skin tone, but there is actually red and there is green, mostly red though. So that's going to apply some weird oversaturation on the red and yellow tones. There's not particularly flattering for portraits. Now we take a look at the second one on the right. This is the one that we did from the Luma curve. And we can see that we have a very nice contrast without this weird look on the skin. So if we had done this from the RGB curve, then we would need to go back to another tool in Capture One, whether it is some style brushes or the skin tone editor, and we would need to mask this out and correct it. And here we don't need to do that. And then some of you might be thinking, yeah, but this looks a little bit too dull. The thing is, it is so much better to just don't break the saturation, and if needed, just add up just a little bit of saturation from the saturation slider, where that's going to do that in a controlled way, where all the channels are going to be saturated in a nice controlled way, that rather than just using the RGB and desaturating everything, because we are still going to have a pretty strong red cast on the skin while we are also getting rid of the blue saturation. So let's take a look at what happened now. This is the one with the RGB desaturated, and this is the one with the Luma channel resaturated, if you like. So particularly here, and basically for if you want to make things simple in order for you to remember, like the golden rule would be, I would use the RGB channels, curves and levels for landscapes, still life, colorful subjects, and I will be using the Luma curve for always portraits, and some photos where we have complicated colored subjects like neon or fluorescent, or things that can easily get a little bit out of hand when we saturate them. Alright, so this is the difference between the RGB curve and the Luma curve, and I hope this is clear now. So I can see again some questions showing up, so I may take some of these before we go on. Yeah, actually David's doing a great job, so I don't see that those many questions. Let's just take one or two. Okay, so this is an interesting question from, I just lost it, I'm sorry. Okay, so this is an interesting question from Janelle. How do the levels and curves affect each other? Does one override the other, or do they work interactively? So the curves override the levels in Capture One. That's like the basic adjustment. So on the pipeline or how things work, the levels are prior to the curves are prior to the levels. So that's an interesting thing, but there is actually, I don't think there is a way in which you can notice that unless you know that fact, as I did. So feel free to work around with both of them. I do combine them both at times. Sometimes what I do is that I adjust the input and output white and black levels from the levels, and then I would just draw the S shape in the curves, if that makes any sense. Okay, what else do we have here? Some questions about can this be used in layers? Yes, absolutely. Both levels and curves can be used in layers, and this is what actually I will be showing in my next example. Okay, another one that is really interesting that just came out from Raffles. In what cases should you use the exposure tools, contrast, brightness, saturation, and HDR tools, and in what cases should you use the levels? There is not a golden rule as to where to use each one of these tools. So I think that that's a process where you learn, you start detecting what would work better for each tool. So for me, the most important was starting to understand how each tool operates, and when you understand that, then you can actually make an informed decision as to which tool is better for which image. I do prefer to work more with levels and curves than with the contrast slider because of the example I showed before, where it gives me more control to adjust the white and the black points separately, when that's something you cannot do with the contrast slider. I do always work with the high dynamic range tool. As I said, I play around with both levels, curves, and the high dynamic range tool to maintain a balance between contrast and not getting a super flat image while maintaining detail. And sometimes, it also depends on the speed where you want to work. When you find a curve that works for a batch of photos, it's super easy to apply to the rest of the batch, and it's super easy to adjust. Also, their layers come in really handy, because then you can apply those to a different layer and just play around with the opacity slider. Okay. Another nice question, I'm going to take it before we go on to the last batch of the session, is from Mark. This is from Big Marker. Any suggestions on how to use the Luma curves to correct fluorescent colors? I wouldn't use the Luma curves to correct the specific fluorescent colors. What I would do is I would use the Luma curve to establish the basic contrast for the whole picture, see how these colors are affected, and then try to bring them back to how they should be by using probably the color editor, the advanced color editor. That can give you a lot of wiggle room to adjust color while maintaining nice contrast between the rest of the image. Okay, so let's move on. The last thing I wanted to show you, and I think this is a pretty powerful thing once you understand how this operates, is how you can color grade your images just by using both levels and curves. In this case, I will be focusing on the curves. You could also do the same adjustments that I will be doing here on the levels, but I do think, at least for me, curves are a little bit more intuitive to do the color grading part, and I wanted to show you how it works. So let's just go back to the color wheel for a second. Let's go to the clean one, this one, color wheel. So again, once that we get to integrate on our brains how this logic works with how these green and red and blue channels operate and interact between each other, it's super easy and very convenient to use this information to add casts or remove casts, as we did before, from certain parts of the image. So when we talk about color grading, we're talking about tinting part of the image like shadows, midtones, and highlights with these different colors. And this is where what I will be doing in this photo that I had prepared, also from David. And another little tip before we go on is, like, before we jump onto color grading, I think it's super handy to think about what we want to do and what result we want to get to and kind of visualize it. So for example, here we have these three very different distinct colors that also happen to be falling between the shadows, midtones, and highlights. So when we see here, this would be where the shadows are lying with these lakes that look blue-greenish, kind of cyan. Then we have these red warm tones that are falling in the midtones, some sulfur sand or something like that, I think. And then on the highlights, we have this other much whiter sand. So the way I wanted to color grade this image is like thinking about these masses of color, where I want to keep the colors very, very pure, and I want to just focus on these masses of color because this image is very abstract and I think it can benefit from it. So I'm going to try to focus on making the shadows blue, corresponding with the ponds, making also the highlights. My objective is going to be making them as white as possible with a slight blue tint, and then to compensate all of this coldness, we're going to try to make the midtones warmer and kind of shift them a little bit towards red. This is how we're going to be using it. We could also do this with different tools like the color balance, and don't get me wrong, I love the color balance tool. It's one of my favorite tools in Capture One, but it operates very differently than color grading from the curves. Again, because when you work with the color balance, what you are doing to the image actually is you're applying, Capture One's applying some sort of filter. It's something like an overlay on top of your image, and also the ranges are much more wide and they interact much more between each other. While you do this from the curves, you are playing around with the very foundations of the image that you're seeing again. So this is why it's so powerful, and you will see that we're going to get some very pure, nice looking bright colors. Let's do that. Before we jump onto the color grading part, again, let's just do a little RGB curve, same way as we did before. So let's first adjust the image to get nice contrast, and once that we have a good starting point with the contrast, this is where we're going to be adjusting the colors from. So again, little S-shaped, give it a little bit more of a dramatic look, and we're gonna have this really contrasted image. I'm going to just open up the shadows just a little bit, very, very slightly, and I think this is a great starting point to start our color grading from. So instead of jumping and tampering around with the curves here in the same layer, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to create a separate layer from the color grading, and I think this comes in extremely handy to keep things separate. So I'm just going to click and hold, new fill adjustment layer. This is what we want to do. And in an attempt to make things tidy, I'm just going to give it a name. Now we can work around with the curves in a different layer without affecting our contrast curve, which is falling in the RGB channel, of course. Okay, so first things that we can do. This is, again, the same logic as we did before with the levels when we tried to correct the green cast. So what we are trying to do here is not getting rid of a green cast, it's like adding a blue cast to the shadows. So again, we can do that in different ways. We can go on to the blue and adjust it like so. So that would give us a cast that is covering the shadows in this case, because this is the black point. So we put that up, we're going to get this blue cast. This is a way to do it. This is not my favorite way to do it. So my favorite way to do it is, if you think about it, you want to have blue on the image. The best way to do it is to subtract the other two channels, so kind of the same as we did before. So we're going to be working with the red and the green in this case. So actually the green is going to be more visible to start with. So let's start with the green. So by removing part of the green channel from the shadows, we see how that is already looking like much more pure blue, because we are just taking away that green information on the shadows that is coming from the green channel that we want to get rid of. So by doing that, this is already looking so much better. What happens then is that we have the remaining two channels, the blue that's been unaffected and the red that's been unaffected. So that could give us some sort of purple or magenta, and we don't want to do that. We want to keep things like real blue. So again, going to the red and getting rid of just a little bit of it. Also, a nice way to work with these subtly, if you don't want to make like a very dramatic adjustment, is just click on the dot and then use your arrow keys to move ever so slightly. And I think that's already working great. So let's just see before and after of just this curve on the color grading layer. We just did the shadows yet. So this is before and this is after. That's already come a really long way, but let's keep working on it because it can be even better. So the next thing, I would typically do the shadows first, and then I would move on to the highlights. So In this case, I think that the simplest thing would just actually be to increase blue just a little bit. I think the highlights are more friendly towards increasing the cast instead of subtracting, but specifically for the shadows, I so much more prefer to remove and subtract the remaining channels that we don't want to work with and keep the color that we want to keep on the picture. Great, so let's go maybe and check how this looks like on the tool. So if we look on the top, that's already giving us some information. As I saw before, this is why the RGB indicators come in really handy. So if we look at the levels that are showing up on top of the photo, we have a really nice balance between the Luma channels and the red and the green, and we have a little bit of a predominance of the blue channel, which is what we actually wanted to have. So I think we are doing it right. And the last thing that we need, because by having this predominant blue on the shadows and this slight predominant blue on the highlights, we risk making the image a little bit too cold. So this is why now it's important to compensate that by using the midtones. So in order to do that, we're just going to make it simple, and let's just go to the red channel. Let's draw this point on the top, and let's just increase the midtones just a little bit. It may be that we need to decrease here so that it's not breaking our shadows, but I think that worked really well. We could also remove a little bit of the green from the midtones, like so. Just a little bit, so that's too aggressive, so I will be using again my arrows to just do that. And I think that's looking good. Let's see before and after, again, just of this tool. So this is before the color grading, this is after the color grading. See, this is what I meant exactly when I said this kind of like super pure colors. This is what you get when you do the color grading with either levels and curves. Again, because you are adjusting the pretty foundations of the image, like literally the foundations of what you're seeing on screen. This is how it looks like. There's now a kind of red cast on the highlights that are bothering me, so I think that's looking better now. Okay, so let's again see before and after. Let's just see the global now. Oopsie, there you go. So global before, global after, it has come a long way. I love the vibrant colors. So what if we try to do this, just to continue with the same logic as the rest of the session, just to bring it to a close? What would happen if we were to clone this variant again, get rid of the curves adjustment, remember just on the color grading layer, this layer has been unaffected, and we try to do that from another similar tool, which could be the color balance. So we would need to come down to a color balance and choose some sort of blue cast for the shadows, again a slight blue cast for the highlights, and a little bit of a red cast to the midtones. That also looks good. I mean, it does look good indeed, but let's compare the two of them. Let's go full screen again. You see, it works better, but you can see what I meant before. The colors, they don't look as pure, and we don't have this differentiation between these masses of color. And I think in this case, it really helps the vibrance of the image, and it really helps tell the story. So this is how you can get to different results by using different tools, and by knowing the most of them, you will in general make more informed decisions. You don't have to learn everything the first day or anything like that. It's something that will just come with the practice. And you know, the curves can be complex, and I feel like whenever I use them, I still learn something new. So you shouldn't be afraid of that. Just play around with those, and remember, all of the editing is non-destructive, so you can always go back to your raw file, to what you used to have before you messed around. Okay, so I think this is a wrap from my presentation. So let's open up the floor now for some more questions and answers. There has been a lot of activity on the chat, so excuse me if I don't get to see everything. I'm just gonna make my comment section a little bit bigger so that I can see some more of the stuff you wrote. Okay, so good question from Julio from Big Marker. In the levels, what's the difference to use the output and the input sliders? So let's use, for example, let's use this one. Let's just yeah, let's use this one that we talked about in the beginning. Let's go back to the levels. So for example, if we go back to the RGB levels, when you... Has this been reset or something? That's kind of strange. Okay, never mind. There was my computer was being a little bit rogue when finishing this editing, so I don't really know what happened there, but we'll remake it. So when we adjust the levels, the input levels here for black and white, you can see that what we are doing is adding contrast. So we are kind of taking, so if you take this level here, 22, and these numbers are not at random, right? So they correspond again with the levels on digital photography. So 0 would be black and 255 would be white. So when we take the input level and drag it and put it here where the histogram starts, we are actually telling Capture One, hey, this is where white is, so you should readjust your white level not to 255 but to 236. So 236 would kind of become 255, if you know what I mean. Same thing with the black. So the black wouldn't be 0, it would actually be because of the way this image is composed. If we wanted pure black, that would be somewhere around 27, 28. So that's how it operates. While we work with the output levels, so for example, let's do the output black, it's kind of doing the opposite thing. So we are just telling Capture One here, okay, so this is how black should be, and black should always be 0. But what if we wanted to print this photo, for example, and we cannot be sure that, we can be sure that the printer cannot go that far, and we're going to lose a lot of detail if we just make it plain 0. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to play with the output level, and we're going to tell Capture One, hey, the output black level shouldn't be 0, it should actually be 10, and the output white level shouldn't be 255, it should actually be, for example, 245. And then that comes really handy when printing, because it keeps us like a safe space to play around with those. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, this is a little bit... So there was one also in big marker. I think, David, you should take it because it's a little bit too complex for, like, it's a really long one, but we'll get it answered, no worries, to the person who asked it. Okay, I'm just looking into the comments now. Someone talking about reproduction work. I found controlling contrast and saturation with RGB curve shifts the hue far away from accurate. Yeah, this is one of the things that I brought up before when I talk about this link between saturation and contrast, and I think it's super important and really handy to keep this link in mind, because when we work with the RGB curves and the RGB levels, that's gonna mess around our saturation, and when we are doing works with where color accuracy is of most importance, like reproduction, we should, in general, I think, try to avoid using these tools, because this is where color accuracy is really sensitive. What else? Hope that you are enjoying the session. I hope it wasn't too complex. I do have a lot of fun having these sessions with color grading and so on. I think that pretty much everything's answered. Let me know if you need me to, like, yeah, I think we're actually pretty good. David has been lightning fast in answering those, so I think that we can call it a day for today. The last things that I had to tell you was only, let's go back to here. Last things I have to tell you, just a little reminders of the upcoming sessions. Those will be hosted by David. So we have 2 sessions programmed right now. One about sharpening on August 24th and one about black and white edits on August 31st. Both are going to be super nice. So you can also remember to subscribe to the channel if you want to get a notification for those. I would recommend you to do it because David is amazing and he helped us all so much learn Capture One along the years. And I think that's about it. So the last thing left to say is thank you all for watching. This has been so much fun. I hope you enjoyed the session. I hope that it was useful for you to learn some new stuff, and I hope it wasn't too intimidating and it actually makes you wanna start playing around with these kind of unknown tools that are levels and curves in Capture One. So Thank you so much and see you soon. Bye.